Alright, in the past week or so, we have looked at the state of things in the PTR, we have looked at the popularity as well as what was being played and what was changing in Mythic Plus as well as in the raid. We weren't focusing too much about the actual results. It's not that we were looking about numbers, about the results of the specs, but rather things like, hey, Enhancement Shaman continues to be the most played DPS spec. Augmentation is being played a little bit less. There is more players playing Mistweaver now. Or perhaps other curious things like, hey, now there is more Unholy Death Knights playing with Sun Lane instead of with Rider, or perhaps there are Fire Mages now playing with Sun Fury, etc, etc. Now though, we have gotten enough testing in this past couple of weeks with Mythic raid bosses, about a dozen or so of them have been tested, so with this in mind, we have gotten enough data to start looking at the actual results, so the actual numbers being put out by the specs in the PTR. We are once again going back to the Google Docs being maintained as usual by Champs, who has done this for like 2+ expansions now, between a release of an expansion or a release of a new tier, having the compilation of the results of the specs boss by boss, and also for whoever is interested, you can also look at the actual log itself of all of the results if you're interested, for example, in any of these specs and what they are doing, and then looking at their average results. Looking at the 90 percentile, mostly because, you know, many of these being in the PTR are going to be some, you know, very scuffed, cursed pools, some pools where many players are gonna be dead, or they're gonna be lagging, or the pool is gonna be too short. So instead we look only at the better side of the results on the PTR to see the performances of the specs. And then of course we're also going to be taking the average. We're gonna be taking the average results of every spec for every boss being tested and see how they have been doing so far. We have one exception right now, Vexy. Vexy we are ignoring mostly because an entire mechanic at the moment, since it's not being filtered in Warcraft logs, it's practically invalidating the DPS results on the fight because of the damage you can do with the boss mechanic. So besides Vexy, we can start looking for starters boss by boss at the results. First in line we have Sprocketmonger Lock and Stock, tested in Mythic already, and this is the first in line we go for because this is a, basically, as you can see from the damage output, it's a pure single target boss. That's the first thing you get to look at the raid performance, how the specs were doing in single target. The boss himself has only been tested once, a couple of weeks ago. These are the average results of specs on Sprocketmonger, which is the default, you know, the default single target tester right now in the PTR. These were the better performing specs on this boss. Worth mentioning, of course, that this one being the PTR and this one being a couple of weeks ago, there has been balance tuning already hitting the PTR. For example, the currently very badly performing warrior specs in the meantime have been buffed. For example, you also had a few other changes here and there, but those were the results overall, talking about looking at single target first. If we can move, you know, boss by boss towards more and more AoE, if this boss was the pure single target one, the next in line, which is still mostly single target one for most players, is going to be Cauldron of Carnage. So when you look at this, you will see that many players are doing split damage to Torque and Florendo, the big monkey, the big gorilla actually, and the dinosaur. However, they are the typical raid split into two kind of mechanic where you have to stay away from each of the two bosses. However, it is possible to hit both of them. You know, for example, if you are a warlock, even if you are meant to stay on one side and hit one boss, you can very simply Havoc and hit both of them. So it's an advantage for range specs in here, even though it is technically a single target boss for example melee specs. You can squeeze in some extra damage as a range spec by staying towards the middle of the... It's kind of similar to the Aberus fight, the Amalgamation Chamber, I think it was the name, where you could have hit both of them as a range DPS, risking also taking more damage. So Cauldron has been tested twice, a couple of weeks ago and just a week ago, both times in Mythic. These are both of the results. Of course, between 1 week to the next, some of the results remain the same or remain very similar. You see that amongst the better performers, Frost Mage is still there, Enhancement Shaman is still there, Affliction and Destruction as well are also still there between the 23rd of January and the 30th of January. Again, most of these results will be more centered around still a general single target kind of fight. Now the next of the fight is going to be Magzi. Magzi has been mostly a clusterfuck of a fight. The tests themselves have not gone past like 2.5-3 minutes in this raid testing. It has been tested twice, again the 24th or 23rd of January and again on the 30th of January. This boss, again, technically for many specs will be primarily single target. However, it's about number one, how important it will be in Mythic to deal with the Galagio goons that lock you in the chamber with them, and more importantly, the mines, which for most players in the testing were not really solvable. So you had these 10+ mines chasing you and most groups just completely ignored them, pretty much. So for now, it ended up being a mostly, again, single target type of fight in the few 2 to 3 minutes that the boss itself was being tested. These were the results of Magzi from the 24th and the 30th of January. There are some confirmations of names we have seen before up here already. Fire Mage, Enhancement Shaman, Shadow Priest, Destruction Warlock, Beast Mastery Hunter. A few of them have been flip-flopping between doing not that good and much better, like Frost DK, for example, has been doing better between the first test and the second test of Magzi. But these three bosses were pretty much where the focus on the single target ended in the testing, because the next three all have a significant addition of AoE damage requirements. So first in line you have the one Armed Bandit. So this fight, as you can see already from the Shadow Priest and then the Destro Warlock, and then the Destro Warlock does have some high target spawn of adds. You have every roughly 1 minute or so, you have 5+ targets coming out. Technically it's 3 at a time, but eventually they will stack up more and more, especially if you, like you could expect in a PTR testing, if you lag behind and you have more of these adds spawning, the real assistants, you will kind of get swarmed by these real assistants being spawning more and more in groups of 3. So obviously, because also the fight itself is quite movement heavy, as you have to move around the room quite often. Specs, of course, like a Shadow Priest with multi-dotting, or Warlocks with Havoc, or even Warlocks playing with Wither, being able to Wither and dot them basically for even more damage, have the advantage over melee specs. So melee specs would not be nearly as advantaged in this kind of fight like the one-armed bandit. Obviously, there are always some exceptions. As you see here, some of the best performers on this fight were Shadow Priest again, Destruction again, Fire Mage, Devastation Evoker even, and then Enhancement Shaman is just still casually there as the better performing melee spec, for example, on this fight. The AoE damage continues once you move over from Bandit over to Bunkjunker. So Bunkjunker has even more AoE available to dish out as a fight, because the fight itself is going to be spawning roughly every minute or so, about 6 hyenas and a couple of scrap masters that you have to take down, and that's quite a large amount of AoE you can do. You can pretty much already see here the timings where multiple mobs are going to be available for the raid DPS to spike up and be able to do way more AoE damage. In this case, of course, Chain Declare on a whole bunch of them is going to be what's up. Every minute these mobs spawn, so of course AoE value goes up on this fight. We can see here the first specialized top result, in this case Outlaw Rogue, doing very high consistent cleave damage on these 4 to 6-ish kind of mobs is quite the sweet spot for Outlaw. Beast Mastery, Ret, Fire, Demo Balance, as well as of course Enhancement also doing well in this kind of AoE damage, which is more consistent. These adds seem to stay, at least in testing. We're still talking about a kind of a boss where the testing lasted mostly, again, 2 to 3 minutes, where many of these adds were still alive. Very likely in live, these adds will be expected to die much faster. The last of the testing bosses, which again was also AoE focused, was Rik Reverb. Now, Rik Reverb has the the special thing where the adds in here won't be nearly as friendly to melees. Once again, in here it's because the adds spawn seemingly around the boss and around the players, but they are somewhat spread. It's very unlikely you will be able to, for example, cleave these adds, at the very least cleave all of them. It seems like you're able to cleave at least 3 of them out of 5, but not all of them. So of course, specs with wider area, able to hit specs with bigger, larger circles, for example, things like Blizzard or Rain of Fire or Earthquake, or things like multi-dotting, for example, can get more value likely on this boss. It's 5 of them spawning every 45 seconds, so it's a pretty fast cycle of 5 adds spawning that you have to take down. Rik Reverb was being tested just last week, and despite what already you would expect in terms of AoE damage and range DPS having an easier time, in fact you see here that Devastation, Elemental, Balance, Shadow, Destruction, Frost Mage, even Augmentation are all range doing very well on the fight, and then again expectedly you have Enhancement, who is always at the top regardless of the situation, but also Windwalker. Surprisingly, Windwalker was having top results on the fight. They also have, to be fair, an easier time to splash some damage from range thanks to the buffed Crackling Jade Lightning now. You can see very easily where the adds are spawning purely based on the burst DPS that this Windwalker was doing, for example. So at the very least, when it comes to testing in these 6 bosses, technically 7 because Vexy was also being tested, but it's kind of a mean boss. So in these 6 bosses there was a decent spread between single target and AoE, and even in these bosses where AoE was relevant, in most cases single target ends up being more important, since many of these adds were mostly fodder, were mostly just padding damage. So you're still talking about obviously single target being the way more important damage profile you want to have in the raid. And then to finish of course we can bring in the total. So this has been the raid testing DPS results in total. We can list them here from top to bottom in terms of results. So expectedly, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 out of 7 of the top results being ranged DPS, with just Enhancement, of course, being the one that continued to perform super well, regardless of 1 target, 2, 3 targets, 5, 6 AoE, doesn't matter, Enhancement was doing best. Perhaps what could be more surprising, of course, has been Windwalker, who despite Cauldron and the melees not having too good of a time on Cauldron, pretty much all of the bottom results in Cauldron because of the split and range DPS having an easier time hitting them. All the ones at the bottom were pretty much melees. Outside of that, Windwalker has been doing quite well. Now, not to lose all hope, there are some buffs that are not counted here since we stopped at the 30th of January. We have already the updated ones for the healer results of 3 days ago. We will have them for the DPS too, but Warriors, Fury and Arms were nerfed, or I guess they were not yet buffed when this testing was being taken into place, so they are likely bound to increase in their performance. You also had Unholy being buffed out of their Sun Lane build a few days ago, being able to go back at least even matching them back with the Rider build and the Minion based build. So some of these results are of course still pending the tuning that happened a few days ago. This is though pretty cool though to keep track of, because then when more bosses are being tested you can add more of the results and then you can sort of cross-reference them with their results prior to the testing, prior to the balance tuning, to see their improvement, or in some cases if the specs are being nerfed, of course, to see how much worse they have been doing after being adjusted by Blizzard. But for today, this has been the overall set of results compiled in here in an average set of results for the PTR when it comes to testing. In this case, this is a Mythic raid testing straight from the PTR. Yes, of course, worth mentioning, there are a bunch of zeros here and there. That's just due to the spec either being broken, being bugged, and the numbers being far too low to even be considered, or very simply not enough results to take it seriously. But besides that, we now have this first compiled results of the PTR raid testing. We will get, of course, a few more of these weekly testing results before we get to the release of 11.1. But for today, on this Friday, I believe this is all we have. We are now leaving each other, thanking everyone for having watched the video, together with, of course, everyone else who has been supporting completely for free, together with, of course, everyone who is supporting by liking and commenting down below, together with subscribing to the channel itself. Now, with these things out of the way, thank you guys again for watching. See you guys tomorrow. And in the meantime, you know, temperature says 6 degrees. Judging by my hands, I would have said 2, maybe even 1.